home. But far above these as a source of myth are the half-heard scraps of gossip from parent to parent, neighbor to neighbor, as they whisper across a fence. A hint, a carefully garbled disclosure, a silencing finger at the lip, and the tales like rain clouds gather. It could almost be said that a listening child has no need to read the tales. A keen ear and the power to disassemble, they must not seem to be listening, are all that is required. P.I. Travers about the Sleeping Beauty. Everyone likes a fairy tale story because everyone wants things to come out right in the end. And even though to tell a story is to tell some kind of untruth, one often suspects that what seems to be untruth is really a hidden truth. Ralph Harper, The Sleeping Beauty. Chapter 1. Gemma, tell your story again, Shanna begged, putting her arms around her grandmother and breathing in that special smell of talcum and lemon that seemed to belong only to her. Which one? Gemma asked, chopping the apples in the wooden bowl. You know, Shanna said. Yes, you know, Sylvia added. Like her sister, she crowded close and let the talcum lemon smell almost overwhelm her. Baby Rebecca in the high chair banged her spoon against the cup. Sleeping boot, sleeping boot. Shanna made a face. Even when she had been little herself, she'd never spoken in baby talk. Only full sentences, her mother swore to it. Sleeping boot, Gemma smiled. All right. The sisters nodded and stepped back a pace each, as if the story demanded their grandmother's face, not just her scent. Once upon a time, Gemma began, the older two girls whispering the opening with her, which is all times and no times, but not the very best of times, there was a castle, and in it lived a king who wanted nothing more in the world than a child. From your lips to God's ears, the queen said each time the king talked of a baby. But the years went by, and they had none. None, 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 sang out Rebecca, banging her spoon on the cup with each word. Shut up, Shanna and Sylvia said in unison. Gemma took the spoon and cup away and gave Rebecca a slice of apple instead. Now one day, finally and at last, in about time, the queen went to bed and gave birth to a baby girl with a crown of red hair. Gemma touched her own hair, in which strands of white curled around the red like barbed wire. The child's face was as beautiful as a wildflower, and so the king named her Briar Rose. Sylvia and Shanna breathed. Briar Rose, repeated Rebecca, not only nearly so clearly, her mouth being quite full of apple. Chapter 2. It was spring, or at least, so the calendar said, but a soft snow had been falling all night, coating the Holy Oak streets. The lynx labored up the slippery hill, chugging instead of purring like the Mercedes they'd had to leave behind in the shop. I told Mother the Mercedes was a lemon, but she only laughed, Sylvia said, playing once again with her gold-trimmed earring. She'd already worried the right one off and was at work on the left. And I told her father would have done a damn sight better taking a mistress instead of a Mercedes for his midlife crisis. For one thing, they're cheaper. Shanna always had to get off on the better lines. The two of them smiled at each other, their quick tongues, dark hair, wide-set eyes, and high cheekbones marking them as twins, though actually they were 18 months apart. Becca, the youngest, smiled at them, but she was not part of their magic circle and never had been. Guiding the sputtering little beige car up the last hill, she forced it through an attempted spin-out with a sure hand. Come on, Roquenette, she murmured. The car had already been very second-hand when she bought it, and Roquenette was the only name that presented itself at the time. She never felt right about owning something that performed for her without giving it a name. Come on, baby, up and over. The lynx managed to crest the hill, and Becca turned it expertly to the right on Cabot Street, coasting to a stop in front of the 3-story brick nursing home. Here we are, she said, as much to the car as to her sisters. Sylvia and Shanna got out quickly, volleying curses at the snow, and walked in briskly. They didn't even stop to stomp off the wet, clinging snow from their Ferragamo boots. After locking all 4 doors of the car, Becca followed. At the last minute, she lifted her face to the snow and tongued in some snowflakes. Magic, she thought. Even when she had to drive in it, snow had always held some kind of magic, especially this year with a drought forecast on every channel. There was a musicale in progress in the home square entry hall. It was being led by a balding man with a banjo who urged everyone to sing along in a voice made breathless by his enthusiasm. About 40 residents in 5 fairly even lines in wheelchairs and straight-backed rockers were trying to follow his lead, except for Miss Hartshorn, off in the corner again, tying knots in her long faded hair like a white Rastafarian. Even the nurses ignored her. Hello, Mrs. Hartshorn, Becca said companionably as she went by, not expecting any answer and not getting any. A ragged chorus of "Oh, Susanna" was struggling towards some kind of conclusion, with at least 2 of the staff attempting harmony. Becca checked but didn't see her grandmother in the crowd. Since they'd been summoned because Gemma was failing rapidly, Becca only looked from habit. Some of the residents recognized her, and Mr. Silvers waved. She blew him a kiss which caught in an exaggerated mime, as a child might. Shanna was already stabbing away at the elevator button, as if expecting that repeated jabs would bring it faster, and Sylvia was replacing her earrings and putting the taupe sweater down over her flat stomach. Becca didn't hurry. She knew it would be a while before the crotchety machine answered its summons, even longer before it would settle with a squeal onto the first floor. When the door creaked open at last, two of the nursing staff pushed out. "Why, hello, Becca," said one. "She was alert and asking for you this morning." The other merely inclined her head. She was Mrs. Hartshorn's private duty nurse. Becca smiled at them both, an extra broad grin to compensate for her sisters who hadn't even acknowledged the nurse's presence, as if white uniforms rendered them invisible. Then she crowded into the small elevator, elbow to elbow with Shanna. "3," Becca prompted, doubting either of them remembered they'd only visited twice in 4 years, living so far away. "One in LA, one in Houston." I know, Shanna said with an exaggerated sigh. "I have been here before." "We both have," Sylvia added, now playing with the heavy gold chain around her neck, picking up the hands of God as if she were trying to pry them apart. "But it's so hard, Becca. I don't know how you manage visiting every day." "It's not every day," Becca whispered. "I mean," Sylvia kept on as if Becca hadn't spoken, "if I lived here I couldn't see her every day, not in this place, not the way she is now." Becca smiled again, but closed her eyes because she was afraid that if she kept them open, they would see she was on the verge of tears. And then they'd start in on her again about how, at Gemma's age, with the arthritis and diabetes, it was just as well she didn't know anything, couldn't suffer, as though the body felt no pain if the mind wandered from the past. Gemma wasn't that old, and she was far from senile, Becca thought fiercely, the anger at last fighting back the tears. She was about to remark aloud on it when the elevator stopped and the door opened onto the nurse's station. No one was there but an open notebook and scattered papers on the countertop were evidence of recent activity. "I hate the smell of these places," Sylvia said, her hands now on her hair, nervously smoothing the sides, checking the black velvet bow. "I don't know how the people here stand it. Mostly they lie in it," Shanna said. "Old houses and old people smell, and I don't plan to live in one or be on the other." "Think of the alternative," Becca muttered, angry with herself for rising to Shanna's bait. Apart, her sisters were strong, competent women, Shanna in real estate and Sylvia a social worker. But together they became bickering children. Becca knew this, had spent days preparing herself for their visit, yet again, like every other time they came back home. The quarreling had started. She bit her lip and silently led the way down the hall. Only Mrs. Bretton was still in her room, crying softly to herself. Becca couldn't think of a time when she visited that Mrs. Bretton wasn't crying, calling out for her mother. The rest of the Third West were downstairs finishing "Oh, Susanna" and probably starting on "You Are My Sunshine," but Mrs. Bretton was sobbing like a heartbroken child. Becca turned sharply into room 310 and looked around at the neat spire furnishings. They had been lucky to get this room because Gemma loved sunlight and it was an unusually sunny corner room. Today, though, with the snow falling outside, the room was gray and cold. "Hello, Gemma," Becca said as brightly to the old woman propped up in the bed. The bearcloth quilt was tucked in so tightly around her it was almost impossible to ignore the fact that she had on a poisey restraint tying her to the bedside. The television was crooning a game show. Sylvia snapped it off in passing. Shanna went over and kissed her grandmother on the cheek, dry little kisses that barely touched the skin, yet still left marks where they landed, because the old woman's skin was so brittle. Sylvia waited her turn and then did the same, missing the cheek by a hair's breadth. There were tears shimmering in her eyes. She lowered the side of the bed and kissed her again. Having done their duty, Shanna and Sylvia straightened up, and Sylvia went to stare out the window at the snow. Shanna moved to the foot of the bed and set her futon tote softly on top of the quilt. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Becca took Gemma's hand in hers. It felt boneless, as though whoever had once resided in the skin had moved, gone. "Left no forwarding address," Shanna whispered, as if reading Becca's thoughts. Gemma, it's me, Becca," Becca said breathlessly. "I've brought Syl and Shanna to see you. We love you." "We love you," they chorused dutifully. For a long moment there was no response at all, and Becca wondered if Shanna had been right, and there was truly no one home. Then, if slowly returning from a far journey, Gemma felt her skin again, breathed a shuddering sigh, and opened her eyes. They were the faded blue of a late winter sky. Becca squeezed her grandmother's hand carefully, aware how fragile a thing it was that she held. "Gemma," she began again. "Once upon a time," Gemma said, her voice like a child's, high and whispery. with all times and no times, but not. She stopped, drew a little breath, and nonetheless seemed to fill up her again. The best of times. Her breath was as pale as her skin and smelled like old potpourri, musty and sweet. Oh God, Sylvia said, her voice tight. Not that again. She didn't leave the window and stared even more intently at the snow, as if fascinated by it. But her shoulders were shaking, and Becca hoped she wasn't going to cry. Sylvia was a noisy weeper, and if she were trying to bring everyone in on her grief, and Gemma always became agitated when someone near her cried. Once upon a time there was a castle, Gemma said. She stopped. What castle? Prompted Becca. We all know what castle, Becca. Leave it. Picking off an invisible hair from her cream-colored blazer, Shanna hissed, Don't make it worse than it is. Becca opened her mouth to argue, but the old woman had fallen back to sleep. They waited about 20 minutes, but she didn't rouse again. That's it done, Sylvia said, consulting a thin gold watch and turning briskly from the window. Time to go. Her eyes were red, and there was a single thin mascara line down her right cheek. She may come round again, Becca said, almost pleading. She often does. And you've both come so far to see her, you may not get another chance. Not before she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence, as if death were too final a punctuation. Let's not go already. Already, it's 3 o'clock and still snowing, and we'll have to fight traffic soon. Sylvia held up her hand and won with the watch, as if that added force to her argument. She was clearly uncomfortable, almost afraid. Traffic? Oh, right, I forgot we're back in the boonies. No LA traffic here, or Houston. She looked meaningfully at Shanna. Shanna leaned over and put her arm around Becca. Listen, we both know it's hardest on you, and we're trying to make it easier, at least for today. You're the one who does all the visiting after all. But Mama and Daddy, Becca said loyally. We know who does the most visiting, Shanna said. Everyone knows. So you don't have to try and share everything. She looked over at Sylvia and shook her head as if to warn her off. But Beck, Sylvia said, ignoring the warnings and tapping her own head ominously. She is not crazy, Becca said, her voice rising to an old whine she couldn't help when she was around her sisters too long. Not crazy, not at all. Only she thinks, she believes, she once lived in a castle, the true Belle of Bois Dormant. Sylvia's accent was impeccable. She'd studied at the Sorbonne her junior year in college. The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, a gone-down fairy princess. Becca with a Yiddish accent. If she's not crazy believing it, you are. Grow up, Becca. Shanna and I have. It's not that, Becca said, trying to explain. I mean, it's not that I believe it, or even that she does. It's like the story is like a metaphor. Sylvia snorted, the familiar bickering overcoming what lingering grief she had felt. A metaphor, she said, using the old baby word the family favored. Thank goodness you decided against graduate school and stuck with that silly underground newspaper you work for. It's not underground, it's alternative, and what's the difference? Sylvia said, turning away. The left wing is the left wing, whether it's above or below the dirt. You don't want to understand, Becca said, tears spilling down her cheeks and making her feel years younger than 23, making her wonder why only her sisters could start her crying. Once upon a time, Gemma's voice interrupted them. All three turned to stare. The old woman's eyes remained firmly closed. Now you've done it, Sylvia hissed. She's awake again. She'll tell that beastly story, which is all times and no times, but not the very best of times, the whispery voice continued. There was a castle, and in it lived a king who wanted nothing more in the world than a child. Her voice seemed to be gathering strength from the telling, and she moved swiftly through the well-worn opening. Now one day, finally and at last, and about time, the queen went to bed and gave birth to a baby girl with a crown of red hair. Gemma tried to reach up to touch her own hair, but the poesy kept her from moving, and she hesitated as if the story had been somehow set awry. Then, drawing in another whispery breath, she went on. The child's face was as beautiful as a wildflower, and so the king named her. She stopped. Briar rose, the three sisters chorused, as quickly as if they were youngsters again enjoying the story, though by their faces two at least were angry, and one, as red-haired as the princess in the tale, was in tears. As if the antiphonal response was all the assurance she needed, the old woman fell asleep again. Looking conspiratorially at one another, Sylvia and Shanna slipped away from the bed and headed for the door. Back, Shanna called from the doorway. Becca shook her head and didn't move. She meant by the headshake that she would stay, and she forgave them their dissertation. And she did. It was an awful urine-smelling place, and there was a terrible sense of sadness and defeat underlying it, despite the silver tea service, from which the residents drank their 10 o'clock tea and the 4 o'clock happy hour in the cheery crafts room, and the desperate strains of Clementine and down by the old mill stream, drifting up the elevator shaft. She understood her sisters entirely and loved them, even though she often hated the things they said. It was why she came to the nursing home every afternoon after work at the newspaper, and stayed with Gemma 3 and 4 hours each weekend, afraid that Gemma might become a Mrs. Hartshorn, who never had visitors and made macrame of her hair, or a Mrs. Benton who never stopped crying for a mother who never came, or a Mrs. Godowski on 2 West who sat in the hall cursing in graphic detail that every rap singers would have envied. They left, and Becca sat listening to their footsteps fade down the hall. She could hear the bustle of the home outside the door, the elevator clanking and wheezing its way down to the first floor, a telephone ringing twice at the nurse's station before being answered by a weary voice. A cart rattled by, accompanied by the slip-slap of the nurse's cushioned shoes. The television announcer's cheery banter almost covered the sound of Mrs. Benton's weeping. Standing, Becca went to the door, closed it, then returned to her grandmother's bed. This time when she picked up Gemma's hand, there was a desperate strength in it. "Rebecca." Gemma's whispery voice sounded stronger. "Rebecca." "Here I am, Gemma." The old woman opened her eyes. "I was the princess in the castle in the sleeping woods, and there came a great dark mist, and we fell asleep. But the prince kissed me awake, only me." "Yes, Gemma," Becca replied soothingly. The old woman struggled against the restraints, trying to sit up. At last she stopped struggling and fell back helplessly. "I was the princess," she cried again. "In the castle the prince kissed me." "Yes, Gemma, that castle is yours. It is all I have to leave to you. You must find it, the castle in the sleeping woods. Promise me." She tried again to sit up, despite the posy, her face now spotty with agitation. "I promise, Gemma. Promise me you will find the castle. Promise me you will find the prince. Promise me you will find the maker of the spells." "I said I promised, Gemma." Becca couldn't believe the strength in her grandmother's hand. "Swear it." "I swear, Gemma. On my grave. Swear it." "You're not dead, Gemma." She hated saying the word as if it made it real. "Swear it." "I swear on your grave, Gemma." The spottiness seemed to fade from the old woman's face as she lay back quietly, closed her eyes again, whispering something that Becca, even straining, could not hear. Becca leaned over, putting her ear as close to the old woman's mouth as she dared, fearing she might suffocate Gemma by accident. Finally she could make out the words. "I am Briar Rose," Gemma was repeating. "I am Briar Rose."